Hey, all you gossiping ghouls and goblins. Welcome back to the Mausoleum, where we spill the tea on true crime and other miscellaneous macabre. I'm Autumn,
And I'm Haley.
and this is Don't You Know? This is a trigger warning. This is an unedited true crime podcast, and we are explicit. Many episodes contain mentions of child abuse, murder, sexual abuse, domestic violence, severe neglect, animal abuse, necrophilia, bestiality, incest, suicides, and other sensitive topics. If you're squeamish, why the fuck are you here? Now, without further ado, this is the episode of Most Lunchtime, and here we go. Finally.
Do you want to put something in real
No,
quick?
no, I'm saying got over here at 10. We got there.
Well,
We had other priorities.
we had to wait for the package.
And then a moody boyfriend. All around.
Anyway,
You put them up in the
they're in the laundry room.
not satisfactory enough for them.
Just have to see how it plays out. And this is part 2 of Sharkception,
Bow, bow,
the mysterious disappearance of Jim Smith.
Is it?
Well, it technically is unsolved.
Give me a recap, because I don't remember.
So, we last left you. Hold on, let me collect my thoughts. We last left you with Patty Brady being interrogated by the detectives of the Central Intelligence Bureau down in Australia. He was being interrogated for the disappearance of his friend, Jim Smith. Why we think Jim Smith is dead is because his arm showed up as the regurgitated contents of a shark's lunch.
Yes.
Jim Smith, his arm turned out, Jim Smith's arm turned up in April. He was reported missing around the same time. His wife and brother came down to the police station, identified it, and through there, police uncovered insurance fraud via insured yachts. Sorry, I'm trying to collect my thoughts here.
Speaking of fraud, I mean, just look from there.
It was rampant. Jim and Patty were blackmailing Reginald Holmes and what was his name, Albert Stannard, for ridiculous sums of money. Patty there was a forager. He liked to forge checks for hundreds of pounds and then get his ass caught, thrown in jail, or get other people caught and in trouble with Johnny Law. Jim Smith, he had a penchant for gambling, or at least running gambling dens out of his billiard rooms and athletic clubs. This is all going on during the Depression, which hit Australia particularly hard, if I remember correctly. So that's our setting, 1930s. It's hot, April. Sharks are puking up fucking forearms that are start murder investigations. The cops have Pat Brady as their person of interest, and we left you with his recount of the events.
Okie dokie.
Now, the cops have already put together their version of events. They've heard from the landlord of the cottage that Pat Brady was renting. Bitch. And we're back with a word from our sponsors. Patty in the interrogation room. He's going over the events that happened. He's like, yeah, I did go to those thrift shops. I did get the mattress. I did get the trunk. I did get the anchor and replace all of that out of my own kindness. I can't tell you what happened to Patty.
I did this. I wanted to make it nicer for you, and you're mad at me?
Yeah.
What?
Later that day, the detectives took Patty out so that he could show them exactly where he bought the trunk and the mattress. Took him back to the cottage where they were careful to study his reactions, but he showed no emotion. He would then implicate Holmes with the canvas in the boat shed. They would show him where the detectives were conducting. They took him out to the boat shed to show him where the other detectives were out dragging the bay.
This is real life.
Yeah, they're out dragging the waters. Detective Devereaux and Detective Devereaux McDermott told Patty that they were confident they would soon find the trunk. But Patty seemed more amused than concerned and remarked that it must have been an expensive exercise.
Well, yeah. I don't think those things are cheap.
No, it's not. All the manpower, the tools, very expensive. With no body and only circumstantial evidence, there wasn't much to link Patty to the murder. The waters were murky. Patty had, of course, implicated Holmes in the disappearance, but how Holmes was involved remains unclear. Despite this, they would charge Patty with the murder. This decision being made, the detectives scooted over to Holmes to let him know that Patty had been formally charged. They were done wasting their time with Patty taking them all over the place and saying, well, I heard Holmes was getting tired of Jim always coming to him for money and how he botched the Pathfinder job. A lot of people were after Jim because he said he was going to expose him, right? So that's he's saying that could be
Expose you.
that, yeah. So they had a motive. Oh, Patty was there. Patty was at the cottage. He was the one that rented it. He was the one
Changing up everything.
buying all of the
That's nice
replacements.
furniture.
Yes.
I just thought I was trying to be nice. It busted.
However, they did believe Patty that Holmes was involved.
It busted.
Well, I bust when a pretty girl squeezes me too. Anyway, the detectives arrested Patty to put pressure on Holmes into revealing exactly how he was involved. Holmes would still deny having any involvement or even knowing Patty or anything about the cottage. His wife backed him up, but their fear was palpable when the seed had been planted. All of this is to say that Holmes did eventually request to see Detective Matthews, where he would tell the detective that he was going to make a statement, but if he was interrupted, he would no longer cooperate.
He really was like, and
Ooh,
nobody better ask me a goddamn question.
right. Sorry, this wasn't Holmes. This was Patty.
Okay.
Now
I'll
that
make a statement, but
yeah.
don't you dare say shit.
Now that the squeeze was on him, Patty began admitting that he was with Jim at Patty began admitting that he was with Jim at the Cecil Hotel on the afternoon of Monday, April 8th.
It's always the Cecil Hotel.
You know,
It's always there.
if your name is Cecil, you might want to not open a hotel.
Wait, is this not the New York Cecil Hotel?
No, they're in Australia.
Australia?
Also, isn't it Cecil in California?
No? Yeah, that sounds more accurate than what I said.
I don't know.
Cut that out.
Never.
You
Anyway, we were at Patty saying that he was with Jim at the hotel on April 8th. He gave Jim the main role in the events around the cottage and painted himself as not really knowing what was going on. He says that Jim told him there would be some visitors come up and said that he would send and told Jim, excuse me, Jim told Patty send the missus away and told and tell the whole mother fuck.
I don't know what's happening.
I don't know. I'm having a goddamn stroke.
That's how I feel right now.
Buffering. No.
It's a YouTube video I can't skip.
Okay. What I'm fucking trying to say.
Hey, quiet on set. Nobody's fucking anybody today. All right?
All right, you guys quit.
The
What I'm trying to say
are going crazy.
is Patty's putting the blame on Jim, right? He said
right.
Jim told Patty to clear the cottage, tell the missus to go away,
Get the fuck out of here, bitch.
be gone for a couple of days.
Fuck. Why are you still here? I don't know you.
He told Jim to meet him at the Cecil Hotel and wait for a telephone call. He said Jim came back to see him, and Holmes was up there along with some motherfucker named Greg.
Motherfucker.
Greg Vaughn.
Greg Vaughn.
He was part of the Pathfinder conspiracy. I don't remember which part he played, but yeah, that motherfucker.
That motherfucker.
He said that they played dominoes with Jim.
Not dominoes.
Yeah. Gambling on the dominoes with Gordon Dahl and Albert Ward until around 6 p.m. when the bar closed. He described that they took a boat from the wharf, went round to the cottage, where they anchored off just inside the sand so that they could walk along the beach.
How romantic.
Very. It was a bromance written in the stars. Patty would go on to describe a cozy scene where they opened bottles of beer, made cups of tea, had some cheese and bread, and chatted for about 45 minutes until early evening, 7:15 p.m., when unexpected visitors showed up knocking on the door. He says that they were sitting, the
Don't
gentleman.
ever show up unannounced to my fucking place.
Absolutely
Just
not.
give me at least a shout.
Just don't show up. There's also that choice.
I show up whenever I want to shout.
Well, that's different. But
Anyway,
Patty says all the gentlemen were sitting just inside the dining room when he heard steps come down the hallway calling for Jim. Jim got up and went and said hello. Not quite sure what the men were talking with Jim about, but he saw that they were dressed in suits. Jim left with them to go out into the dark, back to the boat shack. He heard someone call out something indecipherable. Jim was only gone for about 6 minutes before he came back. He told everybody that he was going to go fishing and that he wouldn't be long and that he might end up in town. He said that he was going to go see Albert Stannard, and his friends, and that he might be back tomorrow. Some words to that effect. I don't know, not a quote. Anyway, he said he was going fishing, that he'd be back tomorrow. He took his coat, put his hat on his head, and went out with the gentleman. Patty would go on to say that Holmes came back to the cottage asking where Jim was the next day. Patty told him that he'd gone off with Albert Stannard and some unrecognizable friends. He then gave him a check. Holmes gave a check Patty made out to him, and they surmised that the men would not be back, and in fact might be meeting Holmes back at his house. He offered Patty a ride back into town with him. In his cunning way to remove Patty from this was Patty's cunning excuse to remove him from the murder scene to implicate other people in Jim's disappearance. Patty would go on to describe the lengthy route that he and Holmes took to get back to the city, said that their conversation was cordial and that they were on friendly terms. He said Holmes dropped him off near the Redford station, where Patty went from pub to pub trying to get some after-hours beer, finally getting 2 bottles from someone he knew at the Imperial Hotel in Newtown. He said that he drank them in the park, walked back to Redford station, caught a train to Hartsville, and then a bus to Cronulla, and finally arrived back at the cottage around 11 p.m. This was a way to bury them under their own investigation. All of these positive, plausible explanations for his meanderings about the city and the countryside would go on to say that he visited the butcher, went fishing for another run, went fishing and then for another. Oh my God! He would go on to say that he went fishing and for another run into town, taking the police all over the place until 12:30 p.m., where he had a few drinks at the pub, and then was back at the cottage, where he would see Jim Smith sitting in one of the carriages at the Art in Arncliffe Station, which was a train station. They had a small conversation about where Jim ended up last night, saying that he only had a couple of drinks, but that he wasn't drunk. Patty told the detectives everything that they already knew.
Does it not say Daddy told them
It
everything
does,
already?
but I'm
knew?
pretty sure I meant
Everything.
Patty. I think my other writing life trickled into this one. Daddy told them everything they already knew. Peppermint anecdotes. He really likes the red and white kisses on his tongue. Anyway,
Thought I was reading. I'm like, I'm blind. Pretty sure that says Daddy.
it does indeed. It does indeed.
These script editors, man.
They just.
It's like they're doing this for fucking free. What, are we not paying them?
It's for the love of it all.
Newsflash, they're not getting paid.
No, not at all. But
if you want, no. There's no way to support us financially.
Yeah, I just work my ass off and then do this in my free time. That's fine. I do this for the fun of it. Fuck it all.
But so was Patty, apparently. Right?
He was not doing it for the fun of it. He was doing it for the hiding of it all. Allegedly.
Allegedly.
Like I said, he went to his deathbed saying that he had nothing to do with Jim Smith's disappearance. That it had all to do with everything, the blackmail. But, like I said, so, okay, Back now. Patty's telling the cops all about his travels with Jim, saying that he met him here and there. Jim was alive throughout the week. He said that he had last seen Jim buying bread and meat on their way back to the cottage in Cronulla. Patty placed Holmes and Jim at the cottage, where Holmes had told him that Jim had gone back to the city. Holmes would then pull out a check that Patty forged in the name of Frank Carroll for £622. He then asked him to run errands, giving him a list of all the things to buy for the cottage, such as a mattress and a trunk. This is Holmes giving Patty the list of errands. When Patty asked Holmes what he wanted the mattress for, He said that Jim had burnt out one of the mattresses with a cigarette and that there may be a row, a squabble, a fight, if the landlord saw that, so he might as well replace it.
All right, he was trying to be considerate.
He said he might as well be blessed. He said he might as well replace it because it was no big deal. It was just an accident. And when Petty asked Holmes what the trunk was for, he said that he had wanted to put some of the gear from the Pathfinder, some evidence, into the trunk that had been left up there for a good while. Patty's story was plausible, and it implicated Holmes further in the events at the cottage and distanced Patty himself from any involvement. Every question had a neat and tidy answer, leading to reasonable doubt in Patty's murder charge. With no body, only circumstantial evidence, and plausible deniability, Patty was slowly becoming a free man. Meanwhile, Holmes is losing his mind. The confrontation with the CIB, a year's worth of blackmail, and being implicated in the disappearance of Jim Smith had him unraveling. He met up with his good friend Albert Stannard, and would drink himself unconscious. The morning after his drunken stupor, he would awake with a renewed determination and find himself in a boat chase.
Oh, what the fuck?
Crazy.
You see me riding
my boat and they're trying to catch me being rich and dirty. Trying to catch me being rich and dirty. I'm going to cut that out, like, for real. But the police are having their morning meeting, which is interrupted by the news of Holmes's excursion up the coast.
So this is how it went. On today's episode of the meeting of the cops, we got a boat ticket. Like in all, like the 1920s.
Yes.
See over here.
Your popular playboy Richie Rich is a person of interest in a murder, and he's out on his fancy yacht chasing his demons.
Chasing something. Did you see that shark throw up that arm? Who was on the water?
He's running away from the shark. He said the shark's like, or the devil's like, it cost an arm and a leg. You only gave my hound the arm.
Yeah, exactly. He was like, that's not enough. He was shorted. Well,
you signed the deal.
Sir, we can't always please you.
In fact, go lay down. The police dispatched the water unit.
That's show manager.
Chasing the speedboat in a hot pursuit. Now, Holmes was a speedboat racer, and his skills were embedded in his muscle memory.
Sounds like it's going to be a chase.
He took them on a wild ride, with sharp turns nearly skirting shores and piers and other boats for more than 4 hours.
Called it.
This ended with him eventually shutting his boat off and letting Detective Haas approach him, only to begin the chase once more once his nemesis was fueled. He would lead the nemesis into open water about 2 miles before he would return to the bay exhausted and spent. He was apprehended and joined by his brother while he was restrained, half clothed, his matted hair dry with blood. Saw a gaping wound in his forehead and gave him some bandages. Matthews would later meet back at the Water Police headquarters, where he would take Holmes back to the CIB instead of the hospital, which was later revealed to be requested by Holmes himself. When he got there, he was given dry clothes and given a look over by the police doctor, who cleaned and treated the wound on his forehead. The detectives let him lie down for a bit, hoping that when he woke he would reveal his secrets. However, after he sobered up, he was tight-lipped.
Whoa.
After 3 hours, they transferred him to the Sydney hospital, where a .32 caliber lead bullet was taken from the center of his forehead.
Whoa, bro. He was like, I'm shot and I don't give a fuck. I ain't saying shit, bitch. But I am shot. Could you,
Like, if I speak, I'm a dead man. If I stay silent, I'm a dead man.
Anyway, we could get someone to look at this hole.
I literally have a hole in my head right now. When detectives informed Patty of the events, hoping to elicit some truth from him, they were sadly disappointed as he had a nonchalant demeanor. The detectives, now under pressure to find concrete evidence and convict somebody in a court of law, they set out to the hospital where Holmes was at to take the opportunity, or they took the opportunity, Holmes in the hospital, to investigate his house and talk to his wife without him there. Previously, his wife is distressed and said that her husband had left in the middle of the night while she was asleep, and she had only been awoken when Stannard had called saying that Reginald had shot himself and to please send a boat to retrieve him. The detectives were surprised that she had stayed home all day instead of trying to see him at the hospital. Rumor about the social circles that they were great. The detectives gave the house a thorough inspection where they found a check for £622 signed by Frank Carroll that Patty had mentioned in his statement. At least on this, he had been telling the truth. Got to sprinkle it in there in your tall tales.
I
Make it
guess
believable.
you're gonna go on a rodeo, but you gotta see some of the manure.
You got to have the reins there. After his suicide attempt, Holmes was more cooperative. He arrived at the detective's station Friday, May 24th, 1935, accompanied by his lawyer and Detective Coleman. There he would tell the detectives about Patty's threats and the blackmail and what Patty had revealed to him involving the murder of Jim Smith. Holmes's manner was later described as wistful, as though he was somehow disconnected from the events. Holmes's manner was later described as wistful, as though he was somehow disconnected from the events he was describing, despite his fragile state of mind. The detectives felt that he was telling the truth, as much of what he told them confirmed. The detectives thought he was telling the truth, as much of what he told them confirmed what they had uncovered in their investigation. Excuse me. Goddamn. Confirmation bias. Holmes revealed Patty had been blackmailing him for many months and was threatening to ruin him over what he knew about the Pathfinder scuttling. But after it was Jim Smith disappeared, Patty became truly terrifying. Holmes described on how the morning of April 9th, Patty arrived at his house, disheveled, agitated, and frantic. He told him that he had a fight with Jim and killed him. He disposed of the body by taking it in the cottage's tin trunk and dumping it overboard outside the port, packing it except for the arm. On Patty's return that night, Holmes began to falter and show real signs of fear that he could barely recount how he had led to his menacing visitor. He recounted how he led his menacing visitor into a study where Patty opened a brown bag that he had brought with him and pulled out Jim Smith's arm, holding it up by a rope that was tied around the wrist. Holmes said that after the horrific display of Patty's ruthlessness, he was terrified for himself and his family. He gave in to the constant demands for money. After 4 hours of gentle questioning, Holmes was spent and was summoned. After 4 hours of gentle questioning, Holmes was spent and sent Patty away. When he left, Holmes called Matthews and asked if he would like the police protection, but politely declined, not wanting the gossip of the neighborhood. When Holmes, yes, 4 hours of not questioning Patty, but Holmes was questioned. After 4 hours of being questioned by the police, they asked him if he wanted any police protection, and he declined. He didn't want to be the gossip of the neighborhood. The detectives were delighted with what they had heard, that they had gained Holmes's trust. He said he was willing to testify that Patrick Brady had killed Jim Smith and disposed of the body. They had made their case. Whatever his reasons for cooperating with the police, after his suicide attempt, he was certainly in their favor, for he went against his word and actually gave a statement and said that Patty ceaselessly threatened and blackmailed him. said that the blackmail began when Patty came to his boatyard in August 1934 and said that he needed some money to flee to Tasmania because, quote, Smith, bastard, had squealed over a check and put one of my mates in jail, unquote. Holmes said that when he refused Patty, he was threatened, saying Patty had enough information about him to cripple him with the bank and put Holmes in jail over the Pathfinder, unless he gave him money. He told Holmes that he would fix him. Patty started asking for money again and again, and when he returned from Tasmania, he would go in for £2 here, £1 here, just a little bit at a time. Holmes went on to describe the conversation between him and Patty that had later happened at his office on April 9th. Yeah, I already went through all of that. Are you getting feedback too?
Mm-hmm. I'm waiting for it. Here's the shit out of me. I'm good. Oh, there it is again. Like sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. You don't have it now. There it is. It's gonna happen. So scared.
Well, I don't think it transfers through.
No, I don't. I don't see it transferring up there, so that's why I wasn't too concerned. It's just a sick beat for us to hear and definitely distract us.
Yeah, it's getting me. All right, anyway. Uh, the detectives told Patty that Holmes had rolled him over, and according to Detective Coleman, who was present as Patty read Holmes's statement, he said that his face had become pale and he seemed quite distressed. Patty handed him the statement back when he finished and said, "That's all right. Is that all he said?" The det- to the detectives, that's what he said to the detectives. The, Patty's words and his demeanor at the cell door seemed to confirm the truth of Holmes's statement and could lend weight to it as evidence. With Holmes's statement giving credence to their investigation, they just needed a few more things. City Coroner Edward Thompson Orem was particularly interested in this case and had been following it since he first saw it in the newspaper. As the coroner, it was his job to determine the cause of death and who could have provided that death. He said that he would begin an inquest May 30th, 1935, where detectives Allman and Coleman, went to his office, giving him all of the facts thus far uncovered. Oh no, the inquest actually began June 12th. Based on the facts, Coroner Orem couldn't determine the guilt of the individuals, but by his recommendation, he could lead to criminal proceedings. Of course, it's hard to figure out how someone was murdered just based off of a forearm, but he did his best.
Well, maybe some decapitation of something.
I mean, there's definitely an artery that you can lead to blood loss if severed in the arm, I believe.
Yeah.
With only two left, with only 2 left feet. With only 2 weeks left to find Jim Smith's body and link him to Patty Brady, the detectives began to subpoena witnesses and gather more evidence. The search for the truck began in early May, assisted by the water police. They would dredge the tidal shoreline and the bay, digging up some holes that were up to 9 meters in depth. Here they employed the usual method for looking for bodies, which was dragging with grappling hooks along the floor of the bay. But the choppy waters made it very difficult to maintain a consistent search pattern. Even with a 10-foot rake, which was a bunch of grappling hooks attached together. After a week of useless trawling, they found nothing but an eel and a few fish traps. They even employed a private um, trilling company, which was a waste of time. While the police were out there searching the bay, Stannard often visited Holmes, or they would talk about Holmes as insurance companies' discussions. They would discuss Holmes's insurance companies not paying out life insurance policies if the holder completes suicide. Holmes had 5 life insurance policies that he was banking on
God
paying
damn.
off his debts.
I really don't understand life insurance or insurance in general, but okie dokie artichoke.
Comment if you want to school us on that.
Oh my god, please.
While detectives gathered their evidence, Holmes would lie about his bed until he set up a meeting between Albert Stannard at the boatyard. Over the next few days, there would be more meetings with Stannard and other associates known as Kincaid, excuse me. He would tell his wife that he was worried about being bumped off. He was right. Holmes would be found in his car in the early morning hours by how do you say that word? By Constable Harold Casey, who was driving along Hickson Road. He stopped his patrol car when he saw a car stalled with the headlights on. He approached it to see a man slumped over the steering wheel with his head leaning on the steering wheel. He thought he was asleep, so he opened the door to see that blood was pooling on the man's chest and that his hands were neatly placed on his knees. He felt for a pulse, but there was none. A mere hour before this, Holmes's wife was calling Stannard to see if he knew where Holmes was. Stannard said that he hadn't seen Holmes since that afternoon. She then called her friend Eileen Cobb, who arrived and told Annie to call the police. Just before 1:30 a.m., his wife telephoned the CIB and was connected with the operator. She asked to either talk to Matthews or Almond and to have them call her back. After the phone rang, she picked up, expecting it to be one of the detectives. However, it was a reporter from the Telegraph newspaper asking her if she knew her husband was involved in a car accident in the city. She hung up on them, distraught. The phone rang back a few seconds later, and Cobb answered it. It was the sergeant at the Phillips Street police station, who coldly asked cops to inform Annie that her husband was found dead, shot in his car. That's cruel.
Oof.
On the phone, your husband's been found shot dead in his car. Over.
Yeah, that's not the nicest way to say that.
No. Matthews and Almond were phoned right after that, giving the news that Holmes was dead. They quickly dressed, making their way down to Hickson Roads, where reporters had already gathered at the crime scene. They left the forensics team to take their pictures and gather evidence while they made their way over to Holmes's house. Annie Holmes and Stannard's wife, Eileen Cobb, and Stannard were there. They asked the last time any of them had seen Holmes, and they told him, or Stannard said that they hadn't seen him since about 2 to 3 in the afternoon. He gave this alibi unprompted, garnering suspicion from the police. He said that he and his wife had been in the theater from 7 to 10:30 and couldn't have been the ones to shoot Holmes. They were watching a
An
movie.
alibi.
With or without Holmes, the inquest still had to begin. Outside the courthouse, witnesses had to enter from the front entrance. Photos of Jim Smith's widow, Gladys, caused sensation in the press as she arrived in mourning black with a veil over her head and face. Accompanying her were her brother-in-law and sister. It didn't take long for the court to overflow after the doors opened. The police had to deny many people entrance and lock the doors. Representing Patty was Clive Everett, who was just at the beginnings of his legal career and had represented Patty in the Londa and Lamero case, where he sued the Truth newspaper for defamation in their articles of Jim Smith's murder. Patty arrived unwashed, with a handkerchief over his face, stubble on his cheeks. Every eye was turned to the shark-armed murderer as Detective McDermott led him to a seat in front of the press gallery. After proceedings began, he was on his feet protesting and challenging. After proceedings began, Clive Everett was on his feet protesting and challenging every legality of the whole inquest. stating that there was no body or any substantial part of a body that could be given post-mortem examination, citing that until this was done, the coroner had no jurisdiction. And in fact, no one could deduce that Jim was dead just because of an arm. You can live without an arm.
What?
He said that
Yeah, we're not.
They could have
thinking it's
chopped off
murder.
his arm. He could still be alive somewhere. We don't know
Yeah.
where he is. We're not involved with anything. We're just saying, okay, so you've got his arm, but where's the rest of the body? You don't have a body. How do you know he's dead? Maybe he just left his family. He chopped off his arm to fake his death, right?
Depends. Okay.
Everett and Coroner Orem would go through a feisty exchange, which set the tone for Patty's defense in the court. In the days to come, Gladys Smith was the first witness called. Every time, what am I trying to say? She caught every eye in the court. They studied her. One reporter for The Sun recounting that she wore a black Ford-colored costume with a small hat and a half-tail black and white gauntlet gloves. She carried a handbag, while the reporter for The Truth remarked that her face was still showing the strain and worry of the past few months, but she took her oath in clear, forthright manner. Sergeant Toole gave Jim Smith's background, and she told them everything she knew about her husband, from being born in England, unsure of exactly where, but that he had no property or investments, and that she'd taken out a small life insurance policy without his knowledge. They had one young son named Raymond. She told them about his drinking and that she volunteered that he would go on drinking bouts for 2 or 3 days and then go off for about a month or 6 weeks. Even more since last Christmas, he'd scarcely taken any at all. Toole had her identify her husband through a photograph and then asked her to describe his relationship with Reginald Holmes and the Pathfinder. She simply stated that they had been together on a failed business venture that was building flats and that her husband was employed as a caretaker for the Pathfinder in early 1934. She described how she met Holmes and his wife and Albert Stannard, and how she met Mr. Anderson, who's actually Patty. Toole asked Esther if she could point out Mr. Anderson in the courtroom. She confirmed that she could, and in fact pointed to Patrick Brady. She revealed that she knew him by many names, some such being Mr. Evans, Mr. Anderson, and of course Mr. Brady. In the end, she said that when she questioned him about this, she was told to mind her own business. If she took offense at this, she took offense at this, but was promptly chastised by the coroner, telling him to sit down. That if he saw this, excuse me. Clive Everett took offense at this, but he was promptly chastised by the coroner, telling him to sit down, and that if he saw that this wasn't fit evidence, that it would not be admitted, and that he seemed to be unfamiliar with how these little legal proceedings took place. But Everett was right in some manner that he was not presented with any evidence that was gathered by the detectives. He was completely in the dark about his client's involvement. Regardless, Gladys continued on with her testimony, with Toole asking her leading questions about a confrontation between Stanley Watson and her husband near the house in August 1934. She stated that Watson had shown her husband a gun and said that he ought to blow his brains out. He then asked her if her husband had told her any more about Pat Brady. She revealed that her husband had told her that his name was Brady and that he was a man that was good with a pen. That was all she knew. In another protest, Everett stood up, but his efforts were for nothing. The truth was coming out, showing Patty and the terrible light that he was, shining a light on the terrible man that he was. A man of many aliases, associated with gunmen and a forager. Sergeant Toole then asked Gladys to describe her husband in the last few months of his life. She said that he seemed happy, that he hadn't been drinking, and that he had never said that he feared for his life or that he was going to take his own life. He was in generally good spirits, if not a little despondent about the economic times. They never had many disagreements, and when he did drink, he wasn't often quarrelsome. He never hit her, he just wanted to sing and laugh. He then presented the letter the detectives had shown Gladys earlier in May, where she reconfirmed that though it was a good forgery, it certainly was not her husband's. She said Jim told her how he was supposed to take Mr. Vaughn out on a fishing trip and about her growing concern when he did not arrive back home. She said that it was unusual for Jim because during their married life there was not many times that he would not come back home or at least give her a call or some sort of message to say where he was and when he would return to her. Gladys said that she recalled a phone message from her mother who had seen a sketch of a tattoo in the Truth newspaper. Gladys could hardly believe what she was being told, but her mother confirmed the awful reality, that the sketch was possibly of her husband's arm. She recounted how she called her brother-in-law and how they went down to the station to confirm that the forearm was indeed that of Jim Smith. Sergeant Toole then approached her, asking her to look at a photo of the arm, with everyone in the courtroom studying her closely. She looked at it for what had to have been an endless moment, the only remaining evidence of her husband's life, a photo of his severed forearm, in her lap. She kept her composure. She stared down, softly saying, and I quote, "That is very much like the tattooing on my husband's arm." Unquote. The photo was not good enough for Everett, who protested that she needed to go down to the morgue and identify the arm in person. The coroner and Sergeant Toole were reluctant to agree, but they set a viewing for 10 a.m. the next morning. Everett was now given his turn to examine Gladys. He focused on the relationship between Jim and Patty, getting her to say that they seemed, in all appearances, to be on friendly terms. She said that she never saw any trouble between them, and that Jim never spoke, poorly of him. Keeping this in mind, he now changed his approach, focusing on how Gladys could be sure that her husband was dead, simply from a severed arm. He coerced a confession out of her that the only evidence of her husband's alleged murder was through the allegations of detectives. Not bowing to this manipulation, Gladys said in a low, piercing voice, "If my husband were alive, he would have contacted me." Reconvening after lunch, witnesses were then called in chronological order, beginning with the Hobsons and their capture of the tiger shark. They recounted their capture of the tiger shark and the subsequent regurgitation of Jim Smith's alleged forearm. First up was Bert Hobson, who regaled the court with the capture of the tiger shark and its debut a week later on Anzac Day, where it would shock the crowd with the gruesome display. Shark vomited up a rat, pieces of a bird, and pieces of a smaller shark. And of course, the star of the show, the tattooed arm. Bert said that he kept the arm to the side of the pool with a stick so that the shark would not attack it again, and confirmed that there could have been no way for anyone else to have thrown the arm into the tank. A man from the Anzac Day crowd, who was a proofreader for the Sydney Morning Herald, Leo Young, was an excellent witness in the testimony. He was detailed and meticulous. He said that he had been there watching the shark with a few other people for about 15 minutes when it suddenly took off towards the shallow end of the aquarium. Young said that he thought it was chasing some small fish, so he followed it, describing how it circled the water, and then he noticed a brown scum on the surface. When he saw the arm in the murky water floating upward, he was absolutely sure the arm came from the shark. He stated that it couldn't have been anyone because he was right there. All of the consecutive witnesses confirmed the same story, that the shark was swimming in the shallows and regurgitated the arm. The detectives testified how they came upon the aquarium, interrogated the crowd, and collected the evidence. They took possession of the tattooed arm, with about 4 feet of rope attached at the wrist. This rope was also produced as an exhibit to the court. When Edward Smith was interviewed, he once again confirmed the arm belonged to his brother, saying that it was undoubtedly his brother's arm. There was no hesitation or backtracking in any of the witnesses' testimony or any confirmation of who there was no backtracking or hesitation in any of the witnesses' testimony or confirmation of who the arm could have belonged to. They were all confident in their testimony. Along with the fingerprint specialist, Detective Constable William Masters of the Roselle Police told of how he had taken the fingerprints, confirming that they were indeed James Smith on September 12, 1932. He compared them to Jim Smith's fingerprints that were taken when he was charged with allowing illegal betting in his athletic club. Sergeant Toole showed the fingerprints to the court, comparing the ones from the forearm to Jim Smith's. Masters responded that those are the fingerprints of a man who, in my own particular handwriting, is the final to two witnesses where the fingerprint branch of the CIB detective. Sergeant Toole showed the court the fingerprints from Jim Smith's records and the ones that John Lindsay had painstakingly taken from the fingers that were left on the forearm. They even had the skin that was taken marked as an exhibit and given into evidence. After a long day, at 4 p.m., Coroner Oram adjourned the court until 10 a.m. the following morning. Okay. Later that evening, a man went to the Rocks police station and reported that he had been walking down Hickson Street the previous night and heard three sounds that he thought were shots. He approached further down the street and saw a man passing the bottom steps. He glanced at him briefly before scurrying on. The man, Summers said he would never forget. He said he would never forget the man's face. He was immediately taken back to the CIB, where Superintendent Pryor interviewed him and was convinced by what he heard that there was a witness to Holmes's murder. He arranged to meet Summers at 9 a.m. the following day at the murder scene, hoping that his luck had changed. The next day, 10 minutes before a court was to reconvene, Dr. Palmer let Gladys Smith and Clive Everett, Sergeant Toole, and Coroner Oram into the morgue, where he would lead them to a small room and ask Gladys to describe what she expected to see of the tattoo. She told him that she expected to see two boxers in red shorts facing each other in a crouching position outlined in blue. Dr. Palmer then pulled the cloth back to show her a small piece of flesh. With a quick glance, Gladys was sure that the arm belonged to her husband.
God, this seems so unnecessary.
Right? Like the picture wasn't enough. You have to make her look at the arm.
Okay.
Dr. Palmer told the court that the limb had been cut off at the shoulder joint. The skin was jagged. Even though the sharp was cut, seemed that it had been done in a circular motion by a sharp instrument such as a knife. This revelation stirred the court, as it was previously believed that the arm had been bitten off by the shark. He produced his report as evidence, showing that there were no poisons or other fluids present inside the arm tissue, and that when he examined it, expecting a shark bite, Dr. Victor said in his opinion that the arm was also removed, though it did not seem surgical, that it was done roughly. There were no flaps left to cover the wound, but he was also sure that the shark had not bitten it off. He was unsure of whether it came off of a live or dead body. He also could not confirm, he could also not confirm how long ago the arm had been removed from the body, as the digestion of the shark had skewed the decomposition timeline. When asked why the arm was so well preserved, the doctors could only theorize that inside the shark, when sharks are in distress, their digestion pauses, and that having been captured and thrown into a tank put the shark into distress, thus halting the digestion, so that the arm was only partially, mushied up.
There was a couple factors at play here. Not maybe that you stress out the sharks.
I mean, just maybe.
Maybe next time don't do that.
He did have a sore tummy.
He did. I would too.
It could also have been that the shark had eaten another shark that originally ate the arm, and the smaller shark would first have to be digested before getting to the arm, which was also stalled by the capture and the subsequent stress of being put in the aquarium. That would explain the bits of shark and the bird, whatever else was being in there, was all being digested before the arm, which is why it still had the visible tattoo. He also goes on to say that he's not a shark expert, so he's only theorizing. When asked by the coroner if he thinks that by the way the arm was removed from the victim, if he could have lived after the fact, and he said that how it was so crudely removed, he doesn't think that there was a chance for the victim to have lived beyond the removal of the limb due to rapidly bleeding to death. So like I said, there's an artery over there. I went to cross-examination where Everett would again try to ascertain whether the doctor could tell if the arm came from a living or dead person, because Dr. Palmer answered that he could not be certain whether it came from a live or dead body, and that, as he had previously stated, he thought if it had come from a live body, he had expected to see certain results and certain appearances that he would have expected to see the effusion of the blood in the tissues, and the effusion would only have been from certain muscles at the end of the limb. But that's only a difficulty, and he had to concede that, you know, because the digestion had taken place, that he couldn't get an accurate description of what the arm looked like right after it was cut off. After the cross-examination of the doctor, the court was adjourned for lunch. But while all of this was happening, the funeral for Reginald Holmes, was being held, and the investigation into his murder was ongoing. After lunch, witnesses would be called, all of them confirming that Jim Smith and Patty had been seen in the days before Jim's disappearance, many of them claiming that they knew Patty by a different name. Oftentimes, when asked to identify him, they would say he was Williams, or to identify Williams, they would point to Patty in the courtroom. Many of them also said that there was a fair amount of camaraderie between the men. Testimonies from different barmen down down to the owner of the cottage confirmed what detectives had already presented. When Holmes's wife took the stand, she confirmed his statement, saying that he had seen Patty arrive with the kit bag, and that a week before her husband's death, he revealed to her Patty's confession to Jim Smith's murder, and to the disposal of his body inside the tin trunk. She also revealed how petty Patty was and how he had blackmailed her husband for almost a year. Unfortunately, this is only circumstantial evidence and it's hearsay, and is now the statement of a dead man, which cannot be verified. Judge decided to admit it into evidence anyway. Everett would tell Patty that this was bullshit and that they were going to take action in two different ways. They were going to challenge the judge's jurisdiction and filed contempt of court charges with the press for what they had already reported for slander, saying what they're posting is, skewing public opinion, and it's a trial by.
I feel like that's an interesting choice by the judge. But
Yeah. No, that was Patty's lawyer challenging the judge's jurisdiction. Yeah.
I'm surprised.
The judge wasn't happy.
I'm surprised the judge put it in evidence.
Oh. Yes. They wanted a conviction.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they change. Sometimes they present the evidence to fit the narrative. Confronting the judge was quickly shot down. The judge basically telling him that it's his court and he will proceed as he sees fit. Sergeant Toole concluded his questioning of Mrs. Holmes, asking her how she saw her relationship between her husband and Jim Smith. Now that it was turned in, now that the gauntlet was thrown down, Everett was determined to implicate her husband and Jim Smith's murder. Now that it was Everett's turn, he was determined to implicate her husband in Jim Smith's murder. He accused her of initiating divorce proceedings against her husband so that she could run off with the young architect. Of course, she was offended by the scandalous accusation, denying that her husband had any firearms and that he had never threatened to shoot anybody or threaten anybody in general. She denied any knowledge of the Pathfinder other than it having been sunk, and that Smith was on it when it happened. She says that she knew her husband gave the men money, but she never asked how much, as it was none of her business.
Hmm.
With all the finger pointing, court continued on. So many secrets were revealed in nitty-gritty details of not just boat insurance fraud, but of Stannard's ill-fated ideas to burn other investments of men held by of investments held by other men. When asked who Gladys thought killed her husband, Mrs. Holmes tried to keep When Gladys was asked who she thought killed her husband, she implied that Stannard might have an idea. The following morning, Everett pronounced his declaration to the Supreme Court to have the case dropped due to lack of a body. This, of course, angered Coroner Orem with Everett's accusation that he had no jurisdiction and that the trial was being unfairly reported in the newspapers, showing his client in a less than savory light. Reputations were dragged through the mud as the last witnesses called were gone, and Stannard, as the last witnesses were called, Stannard being one of them. He showed himself to be foolish and evasive when on the stand. With Everett's declaration that the inquest was a sham and that the coroner had no jurisdiction because there was no body and this was never before heard of, he brought up many legal questions for the future. He did a very good job of citing previous cases where bodies could be presented in parts but not parts of bodies. These could not be presented. Soon this inquisition was dismissed by Judge Halls Rogers, who also found that the newspapers were in contempt of court and ordered them to pay £100 each in fines, and the editor £25 each to pay for the legal costs. They paid up and apologized. So
I guess.
yeah, Everett's like, this is bullshit. There's no body. There's been other cases where,
They're
you
beat up,
know,
but they're all there.
yeah, we've got most of a body put back together, but no convictions on just one part of a body. The newspapers are being slanderous. Judge was like, all right, yeah.
I guess.
Petty had his fate in suspended animation, and the hunt for Holmes's killer was strengthened, though proved to be difficult. Detectives discovered that people in the tight community of Rixon Road were tight-lipped and uncooperative with authorities. There was a rumor that anyone who talked on Holmes's behalf would suffer the same fate. Detectives lost many of their informants. A one Jack Strong was the main suspect, but with full check of his legal name, the results produced no more than a charge of assault in the early 20s and a few arrests for public drunkenness. Weird. As a person of interest, Detective Coleman, Detective Sergeant Matthews, Jack being a person of interest by Detective Coleman and Detective Sergeant Matthews led to an investigation by Constable John Brown of the Rocks Police Station, saying that Jack Strong could be found at his favorite place, the S&N Hotel. They watched the man as he had a few beers, letting himself loosen up before dragging him in about 5 p.m. to the CIB. Before Matthews could launch his interrogation into Strong, he was pulled aside. The detectives had received 2 notes from an anonymous tipster called Number 17. The first note made 3 demands, stating that the correspondent should be destroyed, the letter, that it should be shown to no other police officers, and that if there were any reward to come of the evidence held therein, it should be paid to a private bank account. The second note said that everyone is afraid to tell your men the truth, and afraid that it might leak out, and then there would be more murder done. In fact, my life is in danger now. If it was known that I gave you information, I would not live 2 hours. That was the end of the second note. Detective Pryor told Matthews that he had placed a cryptic response in the personal comments section of the Sydney Morning Herald, agreeing to the demands, and that the second note had arrived promptly. Oh, that was all the first note. Second note arrived and recounted a brutal retelling of what had taken place. The second note was a brutal retelling of what happened to Jim Smith. It contained the following. Holmes was put on the spot. Stannard was a friend of Holmes. Stannard drove with Holmes to Miller's Point. Albert Stannard and 4 killers were waiting, one of them being Jack Strong, another being a Berg McCauley, and some bloke named Cassidy. Albert Stannard got out of the car. The 2 men rushed up and shot Holmes before he had a chance. Those 2 men were Jack Strong and Berg. One of the 2 that killed Holmes. So if you arrest all 5 men and have them remanded for 7 or 8 days, I will tell you. The note demanded that the 5 men be arrested and remanded for 7 or 8 days so that they could get information out of the informant enough to convict. He wouldn't say anything until the men were behind bars. The detectives confirmed what the note said, looking into the accused men's backgrounds. All of them had extensive police jackets, except for the aforementioned Cassidy. They were all known to have connections to Albert Stannard for lengthy amounts of time. The detectives tracked down the accused men, who all had much the same story, that on the afternoon in question, Cassidy and Berg arrived at Stannard's boat shed around 4:55, where he saw Stannard sitting in the car, where they saw Holmes sitting in the car and Stannard talking to him through the driver's window. They said Albert called them over, where they got into the back of Holmes's car. Colley said he tried to talk to Holmes about the batteries and the boat that Holmes was building, called the Ben Yolanda, but Holmes had yelled back, saying he had more important things to worry about. Kelly told the detectives that after 6 minutes, Berg left the car, leaving Stannard still talking to Holmes. Not long after, Stannard came over to them, and they talked about the boat matters for another 12 minutes, during which time Holmes went to the office and made a telephone call. Macaulay said that Holmes left the office a short time later and had the final private conversation with Stannard for another minute and a half, and then drove away, all of his times being oddly precise. This matched Sammy Berg's account, almost word for word. Finally, some people who can keep their story straight. Story straight. Okay, so we've got this far. I'm going to sum up the last few events here. Petty's case was moved to the Supreme Court Monday, September 9th, 1935, where he was still represented by Everett. All of the facts and evidence were presented once more, the witnesses reviving their testimonies. Justice Jordan throwing out some of the statements, which was a real blow to the prosecution. After the trial, the jury returned to the court, and on the second day, with no more witnesses to call or evidence to present, last remarks were given. It goes without saying that there was little the prosecution had that was necessary to get a guilty verdict out of the jury. Justice Jordan would peek out through his wig and say that this case was one in which the evidence is circumstantial, and in such a case it is well established that a jury is not entitled to convict unless there is no other reasonable explanation or evidence that the accused is guilty in such a case. In such a case, if it is found reasonably possible, there may be reasonable explanation which is consistent with innocence. The jury must acquit in the present case. There can be no doubt that there is plenty of matter for suspicion in the evidence that has been placed before the court during the last 2 days, but the clear opinion I have formed is that upon the subject principles of conviction upon the evidence cannot be allowed to stand in the circumstances. It seems to me that I have no alternative but to direct an acquittal, and I direct accordingly. Patty was pleased and dropped his head while Grayson and his sisters sobbed and hugged each other. It was over upon the director of Chief Justice. The jury gave a not guilty verdict. After everything was said and done, there was a shadow of doubt casted on Pat Brady's involvement. And his mates. After everything was said and done, there was a shadow of doubt casted on Pat Brady's involvement in the eyes of his mates. As you've heard the evidence, it was circumstantial, and it could be a case of Johnny Law wanting to get their man and making the evidence fit the narrative. What could have actually happened to Jim Smith? There is no certain conclusion, only theories. One being that he was shot in a struggle with the unknown men that turned up at the cottage and was buried in the bushland. He would later recall how Patty would later recall how Jim told him that he felt as if he was in danger, and that Holmes would be behind anything that happened to him. Even on his deathbed, Patty claimed that he was innocent and that he had no idea what happened to his old friend Jim Smith. He and the authors that interviewed him in his late life surmised that Jim Smith and Reginald Holmes's murder was undoubtedly linked, but who orchestrated them and who committed them will forever remain a mystery. Could Holmes have been martyred by the gangs he was moving drugs for? That was certainly one theory for detectives that they pursued, though with the recent disaster of the Pat Brady case, the commissioner advised them to move cautiously. Gathering what evidence and testimony they could, an inquest was began into Reginald Holmes's death. Though Stannard was a strong person of interest, he was not formally charged. During the inquest, with the testimonies of Stannard, Jack Strong, and associates, the revelations that Stannard moved drugs and paid off blackmailers were revealed. Suspicions were soon turned from persons of interest to accused. The inquest proceeded much the same as Jim Smith's, with finger pointing and reputation smearing running rampant, but no concrete evidence surfacing. In the interest of not making this a three-parter, as we're about 30 pages of notes here, and a bunch of fucking incoherent babbling, I'm going to go off to say that ultimately both cases remain unsolved, but the deaths of Reginald Holmes and Jim Smith have provided curious minds with puzzles for many decades. There are several books written, such as The Shark Arm Murders and The Shark Arm Shark Arm Murders and Shark Arm, a tattooed arm and two unsolved murders by Philip Roop and Kevin Meeker. They all really dived into this case. Obviously, I'm just regurgitating their research and stories. I highly recommend further reading in their books. They really worked hard for it over the years. Yeah, so that's Sharkception, the case of Jim Smith and Reginald Holmes.
That was crazy. Every
Oh.
turn. There was boat races. There was fucking
Suicides,
murder, suicide,
blackmail.
All of it. It was all there.
It fucking was. Hopefully I didn't bore you with too much words. Was really into it, sharks and all of that. But don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Word of mouth is the best advertising, and we truly appreciate the solid. If you'd like to view our resources or leave us any comments on our research and write-ups, visit don'tyouknowpod.com and visit our socials. From Facebook to Mastodon, everything is at Don't You Know Pod. Links in the show notes. Thanks for joining us, and don't forget to lock your doors.